I'm Chan Storland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, joined now by San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Got you on the phone this week, Liz. Great to have you on the podcast. We are going to talk about a fatal shooting that has some in and outs that will be, of course, interesting to hear about. And this one involves you a little bit. You actually covered this shooting when it occurred. You were a night cops reporter back in the day for the paper. You've, of course, moved up since then. So this has some interesting history for you.
Yes, it's good to be back, Chance. I happened to be on duty the night that this particular incident happened. This murder trial began last week, and this morning testimony resumes in the murder trial of David James Gomez. He's accused of killing his business partner, Isaias Flores, who was known as Isaac. And the two men allegedly fought at a car repair shop that was owned by Gomez on April 7th, 2015. And this is a really interesting case because it happened in 2015, but Gomez, who's 49 years old, was not arrested until last November, more than 2 years after Flores died from a gunshot wound to the torso. And San Antonio police said at the time of Gomez's arrest last November that he called in a report the night of the killing, which I do remember. And he said at the time that someone was on the way to the Mercedes service shop that he owned in the 900 block of Bitters Road on the north side to cause him harm. And as authorities were on their way to the scene, Gomez again called police to say that he shot the man in self-defense inside the building. So when police and emergency responders got there, Gomez walked outside of the business and flagged officers and told them that he had just shot the victim, who was still inside. And this, was also shown to the courtroom gallery last week when the trial opened. And this is very interesting because, as you know, there are a lot of states in the nation have this, have particular laws on self-defense. And what's happened here, though, that we're hearing during this trial that is being presided by visiting Judge Dick Alcala in the Felony Impact Court, we've heard from prosecutors that, in the years before Gomez got arrested, he had shared this story about what happened a few times. And according to witnesses, that apparently the story kept changing each time he told it. And this is something that prosecutors said in their opening statements. In fact, lead prosecutor Stephanie Franco told the jury in her opening statements this, her quote was, "Self-defense is not a shield you stand behind when you commit murder." So they are prosecuting this as a murder, and Mr. Gomez has pleaded not guilty. And his defense attorney, George Schaefer, says that, in fact, he called the prosecutor's opening statement alternative facts. He said that we would find out that Mr. Schaefer does not, he is objecting every time the prosecutors use the words victim and, killing. Sometimes he'll object to that as well. But he definitely is saying, from the get-go that this was a self-defense case. So what we've learned in court so far is that the men were in business together for about 3 years. By the time 2015 came around, they'd been in business for 3 years together. They were running a hauling business out of Gomez's Mercedes shop. And what they were doing is they were hauling sand, fracking sand for the Eagle Ford shale that is south of San Antonio, back when, the fracking business was really going pretty strong. So according to what we've heard in court so far, Flores got angry because Gomez hired a driver that Flores did not like. And apparently there was an argument that began because of that. There were text messages exchanged. Isaac Flores' brother was called by David Gomez, and they had a three-way conversation that Gomez says included some threats. And all of this was happening, and it led up to the incident that occurred on April 7th, 2015. So Gomez told police the first time he was interviewed that Flores had called him and was very angry and told him that he was going to the shop. And Gomez apparently kept a gun inside, and there were, they had surveillance video at the business itself. So you could see during trial, they were showing some of the surveillance video. You could see someone arrive, and then you could see, after a few more minutes, you could see Gomez walk a different direction than what the person who arrived came. And then after that, you see law enforcement entering the building. So what's interesting also in the crime scene photographs that were shown was that there appeared to be a camera on one of the corner walls inside the office where this shooting happened, except there was a yellow rag that was over the camera piece. So that was kind of interesting to me because it really didn't come up in opening statements. It did get referred to during some of the testimony that I had viewed, but there really isn't anything that shows you what happened inside that office. So you kind of have a situation where you have the accused saying one thing, and then the only other witness to what occurred is a person who has now died. So Gomez told police that once Flores got there, he went into the office, and Gomez had been sitting at his desk, and he told them that they began to have an altercation, and Gomez told Flores to stop, and he did not. Gomez said Flores tried to go over the desk, so he got his gun, and he shot 3 times. Now, 2 of those bullets hit Mr. Flores. One of them in the stomach or the chest area, kind of like, in the trunk area. And then another bullet seemed to go in, according to medical examiners, the bullet entered in his shoulder blade, and it cut right through his aorta. So testimony that we heard last week was that Flores actually was probably dead by the time he hit the floor. So the photographs showed that the office was in disarray. there was a closet that was behind the desk where Gomez said he was sitting, where it had like two double doors, almost like a closet that has mirrors on it. So you could definitely tell that the mirror doors were broken. There was broken glass and shattered glass, and there was the office was in disarray. There were some things on the desk, but one of the interesting things that we've heard in testimony from the interview that police did with Gomez was that he said that Flores cleared the desk and went over it, picked him up, and threw him into the glass doors. And this actually was from a second interview that he had with police after his arrest in November. So you have a couple of different interviews here where the accused has said one thing, and then 2 years later, he's saying something else. So what testimony that we heard on Friday from a detective that was brought in after the fact testified that the original detective on the case had determined that this was a justified shooting. But after time went on and someone from the DA's office contacted homicide with San Antonio police, they, and I believe at the time they also had autopsy report and were looking at different things that seemed to not really add up to what the accused had told authorities about. So this is going to be kind of an interesting case where, the jury is really going to have to listen to this testimony, and then once they end up getting the case, they're going to have to answer a lot of questions about whether or not this really was a case of self-defense. So, one of the things that prosecutor Stephanie Franco told the jury panel was, why would Gomez need to keep changing his story and make it bigger and bolder? So, you've got a lot of different stuff coming at you. If you're on the jury right now, you've got prosecutors that are saying, he embellished the story and, we really don't know what happened. And then you've got the defense saying that, the deceased was a violent man. One of the things that Gomez told police on his second interview was that he had seen Isaac Flores punch a man before, and that he used to be a boxer or had, been involved in some sort of boxing. And he told police that he, was not gonna be on the receiving end of that punch. So, we're getting to the point in the trial. We were getting to the point in the trial last week where we had, forensics, ballistic experts talk about, distance between the two people when they were having their altercation or when the shot rang out. And the Bexar County forensic investigators are saying that they were probably about at least 3.5 to 4.5 feet away from each other. So it was a pretty close shot. And as I said earlier, Stephanie Franco told the panel that they would hear from witnesses who heard increasingly embellished stories from Gomez about how the incident occurred. And, you could kind of see from one interview that happened right after the incident and then after his arrest in November, that, there was a little more information that was different than what he had initially said to authorities. So, we had a detective Friday that testified that, when the story begins to change, that's when police really begin to wonder, okay, they need to do more digging. And even though this was deemed a justified shooting by the original detective, they looked at it again and they felt like they had enough to come back. The DA's office felt like they had enough to come back with an indictment, and the police were right there with them because apparently the stories began to change. So it'll be interesting to see what the jury says as to whether or not this is indeed a self-defense case.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. And Elizabeth, we have a little bit of time left before we say goodbye for today's episode of The Docket. You've been talking about self-defense. If memory serves, maybe we haven't exactly covered this specific topic, at least in a murder trial type of situation. So this seems like a good opportunity to talk about Texas law in regard to self-defense, which, once again, if memory serves, I don't think we've covered here on the program.
Right. And I'm sure we'll be talking about it some more since this case is likely to go on a little bit more into this week. Now, we will likely get a verdict as to whether or not David James Gomez is guilty of murder, but he has elected to be sentenced, if convicted, by the judge. So that doesn't necessarily happen on the same day, not even on the same week. And Mr. Gomez is out on bond. But the Texas Penal Code Chapter 9 is very, very lengthy as to what constitutes self-defense in Texas. But the basic thing that everybody needs to know is, according to our Texas Penal Code here in Texas, again, Chapter 9, a person is justified in using force when and to the degree the actor reasonably believes the force is immediately necessary to protect themselves from the actor. So, also notable in this case is that Isaac Flores was not armed. Now, I have seen some cases. I know there's been some in, there's been some notable ones across the nation where, people are not armed, or, maybe they're carrying a cell phone, or they've got their hands in their pockets or something, and someone feels threatened and, shots ring out and then someone is dead. It'll be very interesting to see what happens in this case because, again, there was only one person armed, and, the whole, how far do you go, to say, I feel like my life was in danger or I could lose my life. I mean, and both of these men are very large men. David James Gomez is a tall, beefy guy, and so was his friend and business partner, Isaac Flores. So, stay tuned, I say. I think that this will be a very interesting outcome. And once that occurs, maybe we can talk a little bit more about what self-defense is.
Yes, and if it is a guilty verdict, I'm interested to have a conversation about why someone would have chosen to go with the sentencing from the judge versus the jury, if that may look like it worked out for this person. Once again, if there is a guilty verdict, that's a very interesting proposition to me as well. So once again, perhaps something that's going to pop up here on the podcast again. But Elizabeth, that's going to do it for today's episode. As always, great to speak with you. Have a great week, and we'll talk to you here in about another 7 days.
Okay, take care, Chance. Thank you so much.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News Courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me as always for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.